Welcome to this presentation on the results from the report card grades from 10 countries with high Human Development Index in the Global Matrix 3.0. This is a reproduction of the presentation given at the Movement to Move event in Adelaide, Australia, after the official release of the Global Matrix 3.0, and the contents of this presentation are a summary of an article published in the Journal of Physical Activity and Health in a special issue on the Global Matrix 3.0. This is the outline for the presentation. First, I will provide some background about the countries involved in this analysis. Then, I will present the objective, a brief description of the methods, the main findings in terms of success, challenges, and gaps, and then I will close with the top priorities identified to improve the grades in this group of countries. Well, this is a group of countries in the Global Matrix 3.0 that were classified under the High Human Development category according to the Human Development Index. And in this map you can see that the group was comprised by Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, Uruguay, Bulgaria, Lebanon, China, and Thailand. As you can observe in this graph, most of these countries have experienced a rapid development during the last 2 decades, and these are countries that are going through a rapid economic growth and are experiencing also several social changes. These are also highly urbanized countries. As you can observe in the graph, for most of them, over 60% of their population live in urban areas, which could be associated to shifts from active to more sedentary lifestyles. And as I mentioned before, these are countries that could be experiencing unintended consequences of the economic growth and the development, like a greater use of motorized transportation and an increased use of technology during the leisure time, leading to an overall decrease in the physical activity of the populations. Another important issue in some of these countries is that they still have important prevalences of undernutrition and infectious diseases, which make them competing priorities in public health. In this context, it is important to document the current situation of physical activity-related indicators and the priorities for research and advocacy to advance in the promotion of active living in children from these countries, as well as to study the variability in the successes and challenges in these countries. Therefore, our objective with this analysis was to describe and compare the Global Matrix 3.0 findings for 10 physical activity indicators among 10 countries with high Human Development Index. Regarding to the methods of this analysis, all the countries involved followed a harmonized and standardized process to grade 10 common indicators. Each of these indicators were informed by common benchmarks and graded using a common grading scheme, both of these established by the Active Healthy Kids Global Alliance. And also, in order to achieve better comparability, all the data were focused on children between 5 and 17 years old, and all the grades were audited by a scientific committee. For the analysis, a database of grades was compiled, and the unit of analysis was grades. But we also estimated some scores, one overall score including all of the indicators, and 2 other scores, a behavioral score and a sources of influence score. All the analyses were performed using R software. Well, let's take a look in the results. In this slide, you observe the matrix of grades for the 10 indicators in the 10 countries. And you can observe that the only countries that graded all of the indicators were Brazil and China. Now, if we look at the higher amount of indicators with an incomplete grade due to insufficient or inadequate data, we see that Ecuador and Venezuela had the higher amount of incomplete grades. When we take a look by indicator, it's interesting to observe that overall physical activity and active transportation were the only indicators that were graded by all of the countries. In contrast, physical fitness followed by active play and family and peers where the indicators were most incomplete grades were found. Now, if we look at the average grade by indicator, you can observe that active transportation obtained the highest average grade with a C, while the lowest average grade was for overall physical activity, and this was a D-. Looking at the distribution of the grades, it's also interesting to observe that there were no A grades for any of the indicators in any of the 10 countries. And you can observe that most of the grades were clustered around the D. Now, if we try to contrast between behavioral indicators and sources of influence indicators, it is difficult to observe a pattern. We can see that for both behavioral and sources of influence, the grades are clustered around the C and the D, and we cannot say that this group of countries is succeeding in one type of indicators more than in the other. It seems like the grades are pretty low for both of them. Using the scores that we estimated, we did a ranking of the behavioral and sources of influence scores, and we found that Bulgaria and Thailand are in the first place for the behavioral and sources of influence scores, respectively. In the case of Bulgaria, if we look at the information in their report card, we can say that this first place in our ranking is likely due to the high participation in organized sport, relatively high participation in active play, and the high prevalence of active transportation among Bulgarian children. Now, in the case of Thailand, we can see that this first place in the ranking is due to a high perception of supportive environments reported by parents and children in their report card. And specifically, we can see that 71% of the parents support the involvement of children in physical activity. 70% of parents report that the schools are supportive environments for the practice of physical activity, and 74% of parents report that the policies for physical activity are being implemented in Thailand. However, if we look at the low ranking of Thailand for the behavioral score, this suggests that the success in the sources of influence indicators is not yet reflected in improved behaviors. Well, if we look at the incomplete grades and at the research gaps that were reported by each of the countries in this analysis, we can say that active play and unstructured physical activity, physical fitness, and family and peers are indicators that should be included in the surveillance agenda of these countries because there is a big lack of data and it's not possible to have an idea of the current situation of these indicators in around half of the countries in this group. Also, an impact evaluation of programs and policies is required in most of these countries because all the efforts and initiatives that are being implemented are not evaluated, so their effectiveness is not known. Based on the results of the report cards and on this analysis and findings of the 10 high HDI countries, the report card leaders for each of the countries recommended these top 3 priorities to improve the grades on physical activity among children from high HDI countries. First, the enhancement of the promotion of physical activity in the school environment. Second, the creation and/or maintenance of supportive environments such as appropriate infrastructure and safety conditions for the practice of physical activity. And third, the monitoring of physical activity indicators and impact evaluation of policies and programs, as was highlighted before. In conclusion, we can say that the high HDI countries are lagging in both physical activity behaviors and sources of influence indicators. We can also say that the main challenge for high HDI countries is to provide opportunities to increase physical activity in the context of concurrent social and economical changes that are occurring. And in order to provide a better understanding of the situation of physical activity among children in the context of a physical activity transition, filling the identified research gaps and involving more high HDI countries in future versions of the global matrix is needed. To end with this presentation, I would like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Mark Tremblay, Joel Barnes for all his support with the analysis of this data. I also want to thank the Active Healthy Kids Global Alliance Executive Committee members and all of the manuscript co-authors of the work presented today. If you're interested in more details about the results for the 10 high HDI countries in the Global Matrix 3.0, this is the article that was published in the special issue of the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. And thank you very much for looking at this presentation. If you have any questions, you can send them to my email. Thanks.